So today what I'm going to be talking about is broadly addressing racism and judgments about sex trading in practice settings. And this is really based on some research and some practice experiences that I have, but also it's grounded in some research that I'm going to share with you. So today I want to take a little bit of time to share with you a little bit about me and my work, and particularly my lens and my pathway to this particular research project that I'm going to share with you a little bit about. And the word anti-oppressive practice comes up a lot, so I just want to give a brief introduction to that, just so we're all on the same page, and then we'll be talking a little bit more about it as our time goes on together. And then I want to share with you yes, feel free to do. I'm just opening the chat. Feel free to introduce yourselves if you would like on the chat. I will probably not be paying as much attention to that, but please feel free to do that. And Ara and Jean will stop me if there are some questions that might be helpful for me to stop and address. So I'm going to be able to, so I'm going to give you a brief overview of a study that I did that really sort of brings to light some of these issues around addressing racism and particularly the experiences of Black women who were engaging in services. So I'll do that by sharing acknowledgements, very brief background, enough methods to give you credibility, but not enough methods to hopefully have folks' eyes glaze over. That's always the balance that I seek in providing research presentations. Then I'll spend the bulk of the time talking about the findings. And then we'll sort of stop and have some time for small groups to really reflect on how do these findings from the research, which was conducted in St. Louis, Missouri, so a different social context than I think all of you are practicing in. What are some similarities? What are some differences? How does this relate to what you're seeing in practice? And then I'll pick it back up and talk about some of the recommendations that are coming from this study and some questions that I hope you'll take with you from this presentation for your work. And then we'll have some time for some Q&A. Okay, so before I go any further, I'd like to sort of share a little bit about my lens for this talk. I identify, and for really the world, I identify as a white, Hispanic, female, cisgender woman, meaning my sex and my gender identities match. I think it's really important to acknowledge this because I, along with my fellow folks who experience privilege, are really have benefited a lot from the roles of white privilege and from white supremacy that is in our social work context, and it's in our context, in our world context as well. And so what that has meant for me is that I am constantly unlearning and relearning how those benefits, how that white supremacy has really impacted my life, but also the lens in which I view the world, which means the lens in which I conduct research and the lens in which I practice social work when I was a practicing social worker. And so really addressing that and taking time to think about the critical implications of what that's meant for research and for practice is really, really essential, something that I strive for and something that will be an ongoing process. So I want to share a little bit about how I got to this point and how I came to this work. So as I mentioned, I was a practicing social worker. I still have an active LCSW license, though I don't use it very much these days in the current role that I have. My practice experience can kind of be divided into two areas. The first is working with immigrant communities, and this work was mostly conducted in New York. I speak French fluently and Spanish proficiently, and so that language access really provided me access to different communities and being able to do case management, interpretation, support groups, things along those lines. And then it was through that work that I became really interested in gender-based violence broadly, so intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and eventually further down the line, sex trafficking, in sort of the individual and group work that I was doing. I became really interested in sex trafficking because I was practicing at this point in the St. Louis area. At that point, my languages were really not being used very much, and I was mostly doing work with USA-born folks. And as prepared as I was for all the variety of different things by, I had some really great education and mentors. At the time, we really weren't talking about sex trafficking as something that could be happening to USA-born folks in the St. Louis or in, the same thing applies to Wisconsin areas. And so I wasn't prepared to hear some of the things that I was hearing in practice. So throughout my individual assessments, I would hear things like my boyfriend pimped me out, or I'm staying with a friend and doing what I got to do to survive. And, further conversations would really elicit to some things that were certainly some at-risk trafficking behaviors. And so that really got me interested in, were we asking the right questions in these practice settings? Were we providing the right interventions? Was this something different than the intimate partner violence, sexual violence services that we were providing? And so eventually that led me to certainly some work in the practice area, but then eventually to go back for a PhD to study this in a more of a research context. So now I'm an assistant professor at the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work in University of Wisconsin-Madison. This is my 4th year in the Madison area. And, really when I talk about my work, I think about it in terms of my research, teaching, and service. And my research is really focused on improving the health and well-being of people at risk of sex trafficking. What I try to really think about is how intersectional identities, so how race, gender, sexual orientation, for the most part, those are the 3 identities that come up a lot, though I think there's certainly more that are relevant that I haven't quite gotten to yet. But how those identities really impact both the experiences of risk of sexual victimization, of sex trafficking, and also identification and access and engagement with social services. And so I think a lot about those things as well in my research, and certainly have lots of different work in this area that is advancing sort of this overall goal of improving health and well-being for people at risk of sex trafficking. And then I also bring sort of this anti-oppressive and anti-racist lens to the research that I do, but also teaching and service. And I think it's just an essential part of the work that we're doing, because when we think about sex trafficking and violence against women or gender-based violence, all of that is really rooted in context of social oppression. And so not thinking about anti-oppressive practices and what that means for the work or anti-racism is a disservice. So I've used this term anti-oppressive practice a lot, and so I just want us to kind of get on the same page about what that means. And I've got a series of citations and references that I'll include at the end, and there will be slides that we'll send out, so you'll have all of this information as well. But so when I'm talking about anti-oppressive practice, particularly within the social work context, and sort of social services practice context, I'm really talking about the reflective and critical process of actively challenging domination, so things like white supremacy, at the interpersonal and at the structural level. And so this was really developed to acknowledge the inequity, discrimination, and marginalization that exists. I will also add a caveat that as anti-racism work is getting more and more discussion, which is wonderful, part of when we think about anti-oppressive practice, it's inclusive of anti-racism, but in thinking about this in an intersectional lens. So thinking about anti-racism work, but also anti-sexism work for, say, women who identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, for example. And then sort of examining the social identities and gaining awareness around addressing some of these biases around people, and working to really equalize the power and position, particularly of client groups, right? And so thinking about sexism, racism, heterosexism, all of these isms that are really impacting these spaces. So even in my introduction, when I sort of wanted to be transparent with you all around the lens in which I view this work, and sort of how I personally have benefited from white supremacy and from white privilege, that is sort of an effort to really work towards this anti-oppressive practice model. So I want to shift gears to talking a little bit about this study that I conducted, which essentially was really trying to understand how cisgender, so women whose biological sex matches their gender identity, who have traded sex as adults, how do they navigate social services? So before I go any further, I do want to give a brief acknowledgement to some of the very important people that made this study happen. First, to the research participants. Their narratives, you'll see shortly, but their narratives are very rich. Their time and their wisdom was very much appreciated and central to the richness of this project. I'm sharing, I'll tell you later, but I'm sharing some of their narratives with you all today, but they're also written in different forms. And obviously, we wouldn't be here and talking about this without them. So I'm extremely grateful for them, as well as the community partners that really made this happen. There were some really instrumental people who really worked with me, and this was really important in thinking about sort of applying an anti-oppressive practice research component to this process, right? And coming together and sort of really trying to interpret findings. This was very important. And then, of course, funding is always helpful when conducting research. So I'm very grateful for that. So I think when we talk about sort of these research studies, I think it's really important for us to think about what are the contexts in which the study is taking place. And so this study took place in St. Louis, and you could see from the map on the top right that the city of St. Louis is located next to the county of St. Louis, very confusing, but where Ferguson is located. Ferguson, of course, is the location where in 2016, Michael Brown was murdered by the police. And of course, either continued a national conversation or sparked a national conversation, depending on how you look at it, to sort of think about racial inequity and racial justice in different contexts. So after that in the St. Louis area, obviously this was something that was really important and central to the community. And there was a report that was issued the following year that was really sort of assessing the racial inequities that was occurring in the St. Louis landscapes. In my conversations and thinking about racial demographics and sort of looking at things, I think there's a lot of similarities between Milwaukee area and St. Louis in terms of the racial segregations that are in the cities and what some of the implications are for practice. And then, this study took place in 2016, 2017, so shortly thereafter. So certainly this was ripe in that context. So briefly, why is it important for us to even be thinking about how women navigate social services? So there's a lot of needs that come up with women who are experiencing sex trading across the spectrum, and certainly who are at risk of sex trafficking or experience sex trafficking. There's a lot of sort of co-occurring experiences of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, substance use, and sexually transmitted infections, and HIV and health infections, right? So lots of different reasons what might contribute to some of the needs of women accessing services and really benefiting from what I know social services can be really wonderful in providing. And so the most commonly reported services for this population are substance use treatment, certainly because of high substance use rates in this population, behavioral health or mental health treatment. The language is changing around that, so I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about that. And then shelter and residential services and general advocacy and support, certainly for legal matters and others as well. So the meat. So the aim of this study was really to understand how adult women who trade sex identify their sex trading experiences. So how do they view their own sex trading? And this is written about, but this is not going to be as much of the focus of what I want to talk about today, except as relevant with sort of the pieces around racism and racial tensions that emerged. But I really want to focus on the second piece, which is identifying the perceived barriers and facilitators to service access and engagement. So really, how do women access services? What's helpful? What's not helpful? How do they stay engaged in services? What's helpful and not helpful? I did not go into this study with a focus on race and racism. That was not one of my sort of central pieces of going in. However, perhaps partially because of the lens I have and the questions that we had and sort of the analysis that came, and I think because of the community-based participatory research process of bringing folks together to sort of interpret findings, it was very clear that that there was going to be central themes that were focusing on the role of race and racism in these services, and that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. All right. So like I said, I want to give you enough methods to be able to so I wanted to give you enough methods to be able to sort of briefly talk about the fact that to give you enough credibility in terms of what I did and what I studied, but hopefully not to have your eyes glaze over because we want to get to the findings. So hopefully I'll strike that balance. So this study was a qualitative research design. And essentially this was the method of using grounded theory, which is the method of conducting qualitative research that focuses on building a conceptual framework. So essentially what we're doing here is we are in the analysis, in interviews with women, we are attending to contexts and meanings, and we're thinking very critically about the role of social hierarchies, of power differentials in terms of understanding the analysis. And I think for Teresa's comment, I think this is a really important one, right? That when we think about sort of what we see in the literature in terms of what we see statistically, we certainly see elevated rates of substance use among survivors of human trafficking in general, but really I'm talking about sex trafficking. However, that certainly doesn't mean that everyone has an issue with substance use, right? It means that there's sort of an elevated risk, but it doesn't mean that every single person is the same, right? And that every single person will experience that. So thank you for that point, Teresa. Okay, so who did I talk to? So I interviewed a total of 30 women. 24 of them were connected through different partner organizations. So these were women who were connected through our substance use treatment, our intimate partner violence shelter services, our sexual assault services, et cetera. But it was also really important to capture the perspectives of those who were not connected to services, right? If we're talking about women's experiences and we're talking about, what are some of the barriers around women not accessing services, it's really important to talk to people who aren't accessing services. And so we were able to, through asking some of the women who we interviewed in that first phase, we were able to talk to or interview another six women who were not connected to services. And then we also interviewed 20 service providers because particularly given, I know there's many service providers on this call, and, the perspectives of folks who are working with this population with these women on a consistent basis is very important as well. So 10 of those women were connected to our coalition against trafficking and exploitation. So these were service providers who were coming to the table, who were pretty knowledgeable about sort of human trafficking dynamics and things along those lines. But it was also really important to understand, well, who were the service providers that they were referring out to and who were the people who were referring to them, right? And so certainly we had another 10 service providers who we talked to who were not in any way associated with our coalition against trafficking and exploitation, and some of whom were really not familiar with trafficking at all. I'm going to go through this briefly. Essentially, we did a number of things to really have this community engaged process, working with a group of service providers, working with to sort of come together around data collection, around analysis, things along those lines. And so that was really helpful. And some of the feedback that we had around sort of our flyers and things like that, again, were things that I think really helped us to meet with women with a variety of different experiences, and also increase the richness of data collection or richness of the interviews themselves. And so this slide really is talking a lot about some of the pieces that I mentioned before when I was talking about my lens and the critical role in research and what that looks like, right? Really taking stock of how my identity as, I was the one doing all of the interviews, right? So how my identity was really impacting or not the interviews and the richness of the data. And particularly as related to the findings here, how did that process compare when I interviewed Black women versus white women, for example, right? And sort of thinking about some of the challenges that might come up there. And we also did this multi-phase member checking process, which is essentially the process by which we bring sort of the research findings in their sort of developing form, bring them back to the folks who we interviewed, so the women and the providers, say, this is kind of what we're hearing, this is the model that we're sort of developing, how does this resonate with your experiences, and being able to integrate that feedback. All right, are there any questions so far before we talk about the findings? Okay. So I want to tell you a little bit about the women and the service providers who I interviewed. So the women who were, so we had a women who identified, 17 women identified as African American or Black, one identifying as biracial, African American, and white. And then, of course, 12 women who identified as white. And this is pretty consistent with the demographics of the St. Louis city area, in that it's about 97% at the time of this study. It was about 97% African American and white. So very racially segregated and very much in those two racial groups. They were a wide range of ages with a wide range of experiences of sex trading as adults, and then also some experiences with commercial sexual exploitation as minors, but not everyone had that experience, or at least told me about those experiences. And you can see here on the right that they had a variety of different experiences in accessing services, including most predominantly substance use treatment, but then also residential services, criminal justice services, et cetera. As I mentioned, 6 of the women were not connected to any type of social service at the time of the interview, and 2 of those 6 had never been connected to any type of social service at the time of the interview. For the service provider, the racial demographics changed, which is also pretty consistent with what we see in the literature. In the literature, we know that there's predominantly white social service providers, particularly white female social service providers. Sorry, I'm getting distracted with the chat. Thank you, Rania, for sharing. And I'm looking forward to having more discussion about this as well. And then so we see that there were a quarter of the service providers identify as African-American or Black, and the rest identified as white, which is pretty consistent. I've chosen to categorize the sex and gender identity in the ways that you see here because there were so many white females that if I broke it down further than that, it would risk breaching confidentiality for the people who I interviewed who did not identify as female. So that's why that's broken up like that. And the organizations they represented ranged from prostitution, that's the language that was being used, and trafficking specific to homeless services, substance use treatments, intimate partner violence, and sexual assault, etc. Okay, so I want to share with you the findings that we have, and what I'm going to in a minute, not yet, I'll ask Lara to stop the recording. And the reason is for this is that there are these narratives that are written down in publication form, and I can share a list at the end, and you're welcome to read them at the end. I'm going to share some of the narratives with you, but I always take caution in sharing narratives in presentations like this. And so we're going to pause the recording for me to share the narratives, and then we'll pick it back up after I'm kind of done with that. So if you're watching the recording, we talked about sort of the findings, and we then had some small grouped conversations that you can see in the slide, just sort of processing what are some of the experiences that folks might have had in their own organizations, how do they compare, and then some of the challenges that might result. We talked about that a little bit in small groups and then in large groups. So what I want to pick up where we left off is to say, well, what did providers in this study do, right? And, perhaps you can relate to some of these different strategies that are being used. And so this I'm going to summarize just in the interest of time. And so essentially there were 4 different approaches to addressing some of these racial challenges, racial tensions, if anything was done at all, I should say. So I guess that's a 5th one, not doing anything. I wouldn't advocate for that. The first strategy was to separate participants. So to say something like, these are 2 folks who cannot get along, they cannot be in the same group, so let's put them in different groups. While that might have solved a symptom of the problem, that isn't going to necessarily address any of the underlying issues and the roots of the issue. And given that racism is everywhere and in all of the different spaces that we impact, is likely going to reoccur in a different space as well, and or be hidden in a different space as well. There was also this language that was used to sort of talk, and this is, I think, very similar for those of us that do sort of social work practice group type work. If we think about community guidelines or things that you might sort of set in the beginning, really returning to that, which is a common way that we sort of address social work group practice, right? So to sort of say something like, there's no name calling in here, we want to respect each other, right? And sort of leaving it at that. While that may be helpful in terms of building community guidelines, that still is not addressing some of the underlying issues and the sort of structural pieces that really might be preventing engagement. A third strategy was to describe slavery's current impact. So this is sort of getting now into, I am acknowledging in some way that racism exists. And there were a couple of different ways that people did that. So in this strategy, people would talk about, say something like, we had slavery once upon a time, and we're still sort of dealing with the consequences of that. And that is sort of creating some racism or racial challenge, right, in different words. And then the last strategy that I'm going to share a little bit more about, because I think this is something that is exciting and promising and that we need to be thinking more and more about, is the specific anti-oppression groups. And so I'll talk about a little bit in an individual setting of what that could look like, but particularly in a group setting where some of these tensions emerge can be really, could be potentially very beneficial. And so just to summarize sort of the findings in general, particularly for folks who are watching the recorded version of this, what we really saw is that women had these experiences of sexism and related to their gender identity, but then intersectional with their race identity. And that also impact how they viewed their own sex trading behaviors, or there was a relationship there. And so accessing services really looked like, when this was done well, was really done by hearing client-centered, non-stigmatizing language, feeling that services could apply, thinking that providers could meet the needs. When this didn't happen, folks would not access or choose not to access service at that particular point. So this would be, think, an intake kind of procedure and just not come back, right? And then there was this piece around staying engaged in the services, right? And by that, I mean not just attending for the sake of attending, but I mean, or sort of doing what you got to do to play the game in order to make sure that you get the residential services, but really benefiting from the good groups and the wonderful work that social work and social services can bring. And so when this was done well, it was, for women feeling that sort of this non-judgmental open environment to disclose sex trading was a very big piece of this. Hearing that sex trading in its multiple forms could be, I've lost my chat. I apologize. I'm not going to stop and think it. I can't pull up my chat right now, so I will just keep going and hopefully be able to access the chat later. And then prioritizing, of course, client self-described needs. And the piece that we've been talking about the most is feeling that these identities, oppression, privilege, and sex trading are acknowledged. And when that wasn't done, could lead to disengagement. So implications. So what does this look like moving forward, right? So I think this idea of addressing white supremacy, identity-based experiences, and other type of judgments in practice head-on is going to be something that's very important. And as we've been discussing in our sort of group conversation, the majority of social, and I forgot to put a reference up for here, but the majority of service providers and social workers are white women. And so this is going to be even more relevant because of that power imbalance in terms of of the people who are providing services. And again, this is not in any way to say that the white folks who are providing services aren't providing great services. I am a white social worker. Like, there are lots of really wonderful things that they can do. But it also means that we need to be very purposeful in how we address this. And so acknowledging differences, as we were talking about earlier, acknowledging differences in clients' or participants' experiences based on identity and circumstances. So if I was doing this in an individual conversation, it might be sort of acknowledging that racism piece has been a relevant piece for the experiences that the woman has had coming into the organization, and therefore can be a really relevant factor. How can we think about ways to improve that for your process, right? And then for these groups, integrating conversations about privilege and oppression. And sometimes I get comments about, well, I'm talking about substance use, or I'm talking about trauma, and it doesn't seem relevant, right? And I want to push back on that. This is relevant, not just relevant because there's a whole sort of growing literature around and sort of evidence around trauma of racism and the traumatic experiences that folks experience as a result of racism, folks of color experience as a result of racism, but also because it's impacting the ways in which folks can connect with one another, particularly around these groups, right? And that can be so beneficial. And there might be a need for additionally support groups, identity groups, caucus groups. They're called different things, but for folks of color or Black women's groups or something along those lines, depending on the needs of the organization. But that is a strategy that also could be used. It doesn't take the place of acknowledging it in the mixed race settings, but it could be an additional strategy. So for some implications for provider client, and I also want to say that these slides don't follow best practices and that they're very wordy, but I wanted you to have all of this information because we'll send the slides out. And so I'd rather they be chock full of information for you. So this preferential treatment piece is consistent with prior work. We see this in juvenile justice work around, particularly around girls who are involved in the juvenile justice system, lots of sex trafficking going on, that they were more likely to be recommended for treatment-oriented, white girls were more likely to be recommended for treatment-oriented placements as opposed to detention. So this is pretty consistent with some of the challenges that we see. It's also, I'm actually curious within the last 4 years what the face of racism looks like. But you know, there are racism comes in many forms. It can come in overt, physical, sort of that sort of type piece, but it also can come in covert, disguised, microaggression type spaces. And that, at least in my practice experience, and certainly in the experiences that we heard in the study, that was more of what we needed to be addressing. Not to say that the other pieces are important and relevant, but that's what is coming up constantly in social services. And that these sort of microaggressions that are getting at that go unrecognized often, right? So we really need to be working towards that. And so these ongoing anti-oppression kind of conversations can be essential, but also if we don't name and acknowledge the impact of race and racism on, as relevant for this study, African American and Black women's lives, then that is sort of contributing to this colorblind or this I don't see color kind of terminology, which can be really problematic because it doesn't acknowledge the experiences that these women have with that intersectional identity. So that's what we want to do, right? I want to acknowledge that this is what this looks like. And, you know, that lens or that ways that we can do that, we can put that into our, like I did in the beginning, we can put that in our talks and in our conversations, but we also can do that in our individual and group practice work. And so group work wise, there certainly could be integrating sort of these anti-oppression modules and conversations, right? And the idea behind these is really focusing on understanding privilege and oppression, what that is, right? In those terms. And when I say this, I should specify that as well as that folks of color know what racism is and what it looks like, right? And what oppression looks like. It's usually white folks that need to understand a little bit more about what privilege is. And then refuting those concepts of color blindness, you know, and sort of that terminology can be really helpful. And, you know, of course, that this is shaped by our own identities, right? And so in terms of the roadmap of what this looks like for me might look a little bit different than what it might look like for somebody else, right? So the objective of these groups should be increasing understanding and participants or residents of a group, and strengthening the relationships, right? That's the purpose. That's why we're doing this, within the context of racial oppression, of white supremacy, of sort of all of these pieces that are impacting some of these dynamics. And so, you know, for example, this can be tailored, right? So if you're doing a trauma group, bringing in the trauma of racism piece might be important, right? If you're doing a substance use, right, there's disproportionate rates of substance use having to do with race and racism as well, right? Bringing that in, right? And so what that looks like, I think, is really specific to the organization. So I want to give you a sample of what this looks like, and I hope that you can, take this with you, think about it, mull about it, you know, what work are you already doing on this stuff? Because I'm sure some of you are doing some really, really great works already in this. How can it be tweaked and improved? So in a mixed race women's group, right, sort of stemming from the results of this study, you know, as a group facilitator, I would introduce sort of an anti-oppression framework. And so I'm defining power, privilege, and oppression. I've got some resources at the end for you that kind of spell this out in ways. But also, I think some of the women can really come up with some really good examples too, which could be awesome. And in the ACT group, so a mixed race women's group of cisgender women, you know, I would name and describe and provide examples of privilege and oppression. And there's a commonality there of sexism, and there's some differences related to racism. So folks could be able to draw from some of these pieces, right, where they weren't treated the way a man would have, or they were expected to do, right? Some of the many examples that women can come up with, but then also talking about, you know, the fact that there's that the women of color in that room would also have some experiences that are differential based on race. And then encouraging, you know, again, so women could share the examples of sexism from their lives. So we're establishing that common ground in contrast to male privilege, right? So it's why, you know, we have some commonality in the room. And then, validating the differences that, or some of the layered experiences that the women of color in the room have, right? One thing that I think is really important, of course, is that we don't want to sort of turn to put very crudely, turn to the folks of color in the room and have them teach the white folks about what racism is, right? Or otherwise known as tokenizing them, right? But if we're having a conversation around, I want to acknowledge that this is what power, privilege, and oppression is. This is how we have shared experiences of sexism. There are some differences, right? Opening it up and providing that space could elicit a lot of voluntary comments, and it has certainly in a lot of different spaces. And some of the women talked about some of these anti-oppression groups that they were going through, and some of the Black women talked about sharing about some of their experiences as well. And so we're just really validating those commonalities and those differences, and acknowledging, and by that we're refuting the colorblindness, right? Because by that we're acknowledging that there are some differences in terms of the layered impact that in this case the Black or African American women in the group have experienced, right? And being able to draw on that, right? And certainly, and this is of course somewhere I want to go with my research, how does this help, right? And certainly thinking about how anti-oppressor groups can be very, very, are they helpful in terms of increasing the relationship between women and improving outcomes? Organizationally, this can't really happen in isolation. We can't really have one service provider that's really dedicated to do this without organizational support. And so that needs that sort of organizational structural approach. So that means ongoing training, certainly, and sort of conversations, right? Being able to flesh out, what does this language look like in this group that I'm working with, right? Having folks to talk about this. I still have those people, that network of folks that, as my work in these conversations has changed from practice to research and teaching and, all of these different ways, right? Still having those people to be able to learn from and practice with, essentially, right, is very, very important. And that really also should be funded, right? So, as we think about VOCA grants or VAWA grants or sort of those sort of funds, right, what attention is being paid to this, I think would be really interesting and important. The other piece about this is for supervisors, and some of you might be supervisors, there is more and more literature and readings around identity-based supervision. So it's really sort of not just having a colorblind supervision, but sort of saying, you're white, you're working with, these clients or participants, right? What are the challenges? How are you addressing, right? And sort of being able to have that conversation with the supervisor is also really important, right? And that certainly can be part of the conversation around transference and countertransference, which is common in social service work, right? Why am I having a reaction to this particular client, and how? So putting that within our racial context, how is racial identity or gender identity or sexual orientation identity, how is that impacting the reaction that I'm having? So what I hope you'll take with you in moving forward with the work that you do is, how do you want your organization or the work that you do moving or continuing to move perhaps towards this anti-oppressive practice model? And I'm sure there are many strengths that your organization brings to this potential goal. And I'm sure there are quite a few challenges, right? So what are those? What are the information or resources and key stakeholders that need to be involved in addressing this organizationally, not just, on the individual level? And maybe that looks like integrating this into a strategic plan of some sort, right? And I know, even at our own 4W meeting the other day, we were just talking about how does this look like for our organization, different type of work, but the same type of conversation at its fundamental roots. I have a series of readings and then a conference that might be helpful, or some folks that might be able to do some consulting work and things like that. And the So You Want to Talk About Race book is, I think, just a really helpful, easy book to read around talking about this. And then the resources on the top are a little bit more within a social work context, social service context, et cetera, that I think can be really helpful. I want to thank you for your time, and I hope that there are some questions.